Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping straight into a fascinating, frankly fierce debate over biblical interpretation that's playing out right now in modern politics. You know, when ancient texts meet modern legislation, the sparks always fly. And today, we're analyzing a specific clash that perfectly highlights how differently people can read the exact same book.
Here's the roadmap for today. Number 1, the political dispute. 2, analyzing arguments from silence. 3, critiquing modern biblical interpretation. And 4, the spiritual warfare perspective. All right, let's get right into it.
Starting with Section 1, the political dispute, a clash of convictions.
The inciting incident for our analysis today centers on a highly public disagreement between Texas Democratic Senate candidate James Talarico and the well-known evangelist Franklin Graham. This clash really forces us to ask, how do we determine what a sacred text actually says about a thoroughly modern issue? And this brilliantly illustrates the core tension. On one side, candidate James Talarico publicly stated that the Bible is essentially silent on the topic of abortion. But on the other side, Franklin Graham delivered a really sharp rebuke on social media, straight up calling Talarico's claim an absolute lie. Graham's stance is that the Bible explicitly commands, "You shall not murder," and he applies that directly to this issue. It's a fundamental, ground-level disagreement on what constitutes biblical instruction.
To back up his rebuke, Graham anchors his theological argument using specific scriptures, starting with Jeremiah 1:5. It says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart." Notice the emphasis on the words "knew" and "set you apart." The argument the source makes here is that God, according to this text, has a deliberate, pre-existing plan, actually knowing the unborn baby before it's even physically formed. To them, this establishes a clear, premeditated value for human life.
Graham also points directly to Exodus 20:13, "You shall not murder." For Graham and the commentators analyzing all this, applying this foundational commandment to abortion isn't some massive, complex theological leap. They argue it's simply a matter of common sense regarding the protection of human life.
Moving to Section 2, analyzing arguments from silence, deconstructing the rhetoric.
Talarico's claim that the specific word abortion isn't in the Bible is labeled by the podcast hosts we're analyzing as a very specific logical and rhetorical fallacy. So, the crucial point is understanding this definition. An argument from silence occurs when someone draws a conclusion based entirely on the absence of an explicit statement. The hosts draw a really interesting parallel here with certain Islamic apologetics, where critics will sometimes ask, where does Jesus explicitly say, "I am God, worship me," verbatim? The counterargument, of course, is that while that hyper-specific modern phrasing might be absent, the entirety of the New Testament features Jesus claiming divinity. Demanding a verbatim quote, they argue, completely misses the broader, undeniable context of the text.
To highlight the logical flaw in this tactic, the commentators provide a rapid-fire, slightly absurd list of modern issues that Jesus never explicitly named. I mean, think about it. Jesus didn't explicitly forbid falling in love with artificial intelligence, or gambling your entire life savings away in Las Vegas, or lusting after images on computer screens, or giving kids synthetic hormones. The argument is incredibly straightforward. Ancient scripture obviously doesn't use modern terminology for every specific contemporary issue. Therefore, the hosts argue that equating scriptural silence to outright approval is a deeply flawed way to read the text.
The core argument here is summarized with a really powerful conclusion from the source material. Just because it's not explicitly there doesn't mean God doesn't shout loudly about this subject. Demanding a hyper-specific, modern word in an ancient text to bypass overarching moral themes is viewed by these commentators as lazy, dishonest, and fundamentally unbiblical.
Let's look at Section 3, critiquing modern biblical interpretation, progressive versus orthodox.
The source material broadens this critique past just a single politician to address a much wider movement, contrasting what they call extreme progressive Christianity with orthodox traditional interpretation. Now, what's really interesting about this ideological divide is how stark the contrast is. According to the hosts, on the progressive side, there's a tendency to cherry-pick agreeable verses, read modern preferences into the ancient text, and ultimately make yourself God by letting your desires dictate your faith. But on the orthodox side, the goal is total submission to Scripture. It's about letting the text reveal your flaws so God can refine you, and adhering to sound doctrine, even and maybe especially when it's incredibly uncomfortable. To underline this critique, the source looks at Timothy chapter 4. For the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. Think about how perfectly itching ears translates to our modern digital age. It's literally the ancient description of an echo chamber. Modern progressive interpretations are accused here of seeking out podcasts, algorithms, and politicians who simply validate what they already want to believe rather than submitting to the ultimate authority of the text itself.
Furthermore, the podcast argues that if you cherry-pick the teachings of Jesus that you like, say his messages on love or charity, while completely ignoring the harder truths, you miss the entire climax of the Christian faith. Jesus' moral teachings are an inseparable package. They absolutely cannot be divorced from his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his ultimate purpose, which is to free humanity from the bondage of sin and death. The argument is that stripping away that context leaves you with a distorted, completely incomplete picture.
Which brings us to Section 4, the spiritual warfare perspective, beyond politics.
This brings us to a perspective that elevates this entire discussion far beyond a mere political spat. We return to Franklin Graham's final assessment of Talarico, where he warns his audience, "Don't be deceived by wicked politicians spouting lies." To understand why Graham uses such intensely strong language, the source brings up some context. In 2021, Talarico opposed a bill regarding biological men and women's sports by claiming that God is non-binary. For Graham and traditional commentators, this is profound evidence of someone twisting scripture to fit a modern political agenda. The commentators analyzing this express a real, profound exhaustion with the current landscape. They are tired of having to debate what they view as basic common sense 30 times a month, having to constantly reiterate that the Bible is not silent on issues like the value of human life, reveals a blindness so profound that it can't just be chalked up to political ignorance. To them, this persistent, exhausting divide is actual evidence pointing to much deeper, unseen issues that play in our culture.
And that leads to their final theological framework, found in Ephesians 6. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. These exhausting political arguments are merely symptoms. This framework reframes the entire political argument into a spiritual one. They believe we are witnessing a larger, underlying spiritual battle. The politicians and opposing commentators aren't the ultimate enemy here. They are viewed as individuals caught in a much deeper spiritual confusion.
So what is the prescribed Christian response? It's a call to action that actively shifts away from typical political outrage. Look, it is incredibly easy to get furious at a candidate or a pundit on the news, right? But the required response here isn't political anger, it is targeted prayer. The hosts conclude that if these are deeply spiritually rooted ideas, they absolutely require a spiritual response to root them out.
This explainer highlights exactly how differently people can view the exact same ancient text, and how those differences have massive, real-world implications, which leaves us with this to think about. As theological debates increasingly enter the political arena, how will differing interpretations of ancient texts continue to shape modern legislation? Thanks for watching The Explainer.